So just at the beginning here, I want to apologize. One of our panelists, Eltahir, could not be here today. He was unable to make the trip down from MIT. So we still, I think what he did manage to get was his talk down to us. So what I'm going to do here at the beginning is actually give a little bit of background on some of the concepts that Fatih was going to talk about. Both he and I share a very strong interest in understanding hydrological dynamics in African ecosystems and in drylands generally, and have spent a lot of our careers looking at how vegetation and climate interact, and as I was introduced, the kind of eco-hydrology, so the questions about ecosystems and hydrology and what that means in terms of sustainability of landscapes and how we use those landscapes and possibly develop them. So if I need to, I have some slides to send up. I'm not sure how to do that. They're right here. I see them. But they're not there. But we do have a little extra time in this session, which is lucky.
Where did Frank go?
Yeah, there was someone who was doing this before quite effectively. He's not here now. So, right.
Okay.
So this doesn't go on my tenure review, I hope. What do you think? We did the F7. No. Well, darn. Sure. Okay. Well, at any rate, let me just give you a little bit of background about what I'll be showing you, and it comes up. Oh, okay. That's when you give up, it finally happens. Okay. Here we are. So just a little bit about this panel. We really are going to be addressing three separate subjects that should be much more interrelated in terms of how we think about development of dryland ecosystems, and really in a lot of the developing world, because a lot of the developing world shares some of the similar environmental challenges. So where I'm going to be focusing in this talk is in that maintenance of ecosystem services and some of the background about how these landscapes behave. And in general, this is going to be focusing mostly on Africa. This is where my work is. This is where the Water in Africa project at Princeton has begun, and our work at Impala, if you were here in the earlier session with some of the undergraduates who have done work out there. So a lot of this is related to the dynamics of development in Africa as kind of a classical example of developing regions. And I'm going to show you this because I came from a geography department through some maps. And so these cartograms, what you're going to be seeing is a series of images where the areas that are represented are weighted by the variable of interest. Okay, so this is a Peters projection of land area, which is just kind of proof that Mercator was Flemish, because the Mercator projection is about the only thing that makes Europe look very large. And you can see Africa there. If you redo this map by population, then of course you see the huge population in South and Southeast Asia. If you look at population projections, one of the things that jumps out at you is that a lot of that growth is expected to occur in sub-Saharan Africa. One of the interesting things about Africa, one of the misconceptions about this region is that it is kind of universally poor in terms of water resources. In terms of global rainfall distribution, it is an equatorial continent. There's quite a lot of rainfall, but when you look at the way that rainfall gets translated into available water resources in terms of both water quality and quantity of surface water available for populations, the differences between, for instance, South America or even Australia are very stark. And so this is really one of the central challenges of development. I'm going to come back to this again and again. The importance of water as a catalyst for developing these regions. GDP per person, of course, these maps are going to continually to get more and more depressing. I apologize. This is actually a good one. You would say, okay, this is quite nice. The forest cover, forest resources. You see there in that map the broad belt of woodlands in sub-Saharan Africa and Zambia and Mozambique and even into Angola. Unfortunately, when we look at forest cover losses, we're outpacing in Africa even the kind of classical Amazon deforestation. So again, that goes back to the past panel on energy use. A lot of this continent is still using biofuels in the traditional sense for all of their energy. And so a lot of that is going directly into charcoal production, which is used as a household fuel. And then these two, which are the most critical that we'll be talking about tomorrow, human health, malaria deaths and drought deaths. Africa is really, this is a huge challenge. And both of those are related to the distribution of water, because water is both a vector of disease and also a way to help prevent it. So thinking about development again, development in the developing world is really going to require water. These pie graphs here show you the proportion of water use at the continental level or subcontinental level in three broad sectors. And industry, as you can see, in most of the developing world is the dominant use of water. If you want to develop these other regions, that water is going to have to go somehow into industry. It's very hard to separate real economic development from intensification of water use in the industrial sector. That means also that you can't, it's a zero-sum game, that water cannot come from the other sectors, okay? It has to grow somehow internally and intrinsically inside these regions. And in all these areas where the industry sector is very small, it will be growing rapidly, and the population, the amount dedicated to agriculture and domestic really can't go down much, okay? We can't really mess with that. It's not all bad news. There are some opportunities, but they're very challenging in the sense of the way we think about traditional ways out of the box. One of the real obvious and easy solutions in Africa is hydroelectric power. But there's a lot of environmental and economic challenges associated with that route. So when we think about development, really we're thinking about water. And when I think about water, I'm thinking about landscapes a lot of times and how landscapes interact with water. So this is some work by a group, Foley et al. In 2005 Science. And what you're seeing is just kind of a classical trajectory of how landscapes change. So now thinking about just the composition of, say, even something like North America, just the trajectories that the ecosystems went through as we went from pre-settlement to what we might call industrialization. And a lot of the developing world sits in this region here. And the real question is, as subsistence agriculture and small-scale farms are going down, as the proportion of the landscape dedicated to this, which is right now in a lot of these areas is almost all the landscape, what's going to fill the place? Intensive agriculture sometimes is just a non-starter in these areas because there's not a lot of, like we just showed, the water resources are unavailable. In a lot of the world right now, as this is going down, this is being replaced by degraded landscapes, landscapes that almost perform no economic value. So what we're having is transitions from minimum economic value, if you think about the actual, what we can get out of this landscape, to landscapes that instead of are intensifying and having higher yield per unit area are actually decreasing. So this graph shows a good example of what the trajectories look like for the northern hemisphere. It's not necessarily a reflection of what it might look like in the southern hemisphere. And the reasons really have to do with, if you think about the distribution of land cover in these regions, a lot of the southern hemisphere is taken up by pastures and rangelands. And if you look at these maps in the northern hemisphere, and even in some of the most developed regions in the world, those are still areas that are mostly pasture and rangelands. It's not easy to flip those areas into agriculture. The areas that are intensely agricultural in the U.S., even some of the upper, like the Ohio Basin, certainly the conversion of the prairies into the breadbelt of America was very important. But even the upper Ohio River Valley, those were wetland forests that were cleared for agriculture. Those ecosystems aren't available in a lot of the developing world. So that intensification of agriculture is a real challenge. The other challenge is the intermittency of the most important resource in the region, which is water. This is showing you just the last 50 years of water availability measured as soil moisture over different regions of Africa. This here is the Sahel region, okay, over here, the Sahel Sudan area. Each of these points to a different place. You can see that different regions have different characteristic levels of variability. Certainly, over here in the Sahel droughts, we have very long-term persistent patterns of lower soil moisture. That is a critical challenge to overcome when you think about trying to sustain these landscapes or intensify their use. The picture doesn't get much better in some of these other areas just because very high frequency intermittency and very large intermittency from year to year, going from, these are kind of in quantiles, okay, so this is the relative value. So from one year to the next, going basically from the highest amount of soil moisture on record to the lowest. So huge interannual variability. Both long-term persistent moisture deficits are a problem, but also highly intermittent moisture availability is a problem because neither one of those are easily adaptable and amenable to the traditional ways that we manage landscapes in a lot of the developed world, where we count on either persistent water supply or persistent inavailability of water, which we then mediate by long-range movement of water or some other mediation. So looking at drought frequency, you can think about the duration of drought. So these are just kind of measured 3 to 6 months, 6 to 12 months, longer, up to years. And there's real clear patterns. Obviously, the Sahel-Sudan region, again, this line here where we're going from the Sahara region to sub-Saharan, is some of the areas that has the most persistent and long-term droughts that we've observed in the last 50 years. Whereas other regions, here this is now the Congo Basin, have much more frequent intermittent but shorter-term droughts. And so these necessitate different ideas about development in different parts of this continent. So again, the monolithic Africa doesn't really work even from a climate point of view. Right now here at Princeton, we're starting to get our heads around some of this. This is an image today from a professor in our department, Eric Wood's group, actually showing the projections of soil moisture today in Africa based on remote sensing data. So it's something that we're getting good at being able to monitor, and that we hope to, going forward, some more images of the same type that we'll be able to predict and have a better idea of how climate change is going to impact these landscapes. And in almost all these images, the red bar on the right is the future climate scenarios, kind of taking a mean of what we're getting out of the GCMs now. And you can see that for all classes of short-term, medium-term, and long-term drought, and in almost all regions of Africa, these being kind of broadly west, east, South Africa, and the Saharan region, that the incidences of drought are going to go up, and the severity then will also be going up. Where my work is and where Fatih's work is, this is actually from some slides that Fatih sent, is I just want you, the upper panel is vegetation density, so it's the amount of vegetation, and the lower panel is rainfall. This is just a simulation, okay, but it captures the essential dynamics of a lot of these ecosystems. If the manipulation is to rapidly all of a sudden increase rainfall, and this is actually done by increasing vegetation. So let's just say we went out and did a greening experiment where we were planting, doing agroforestry or something like that. Then what happens through time is actually we get a return back to some equilibrium value. Okay, so kind of a classic systems theory. We have a pulse and then a return to the equilibrium. That pulse actually gets reflected in the rainfall. There's an interaction between the vegetation and the rainfall. The climate feeds off of the vegetation. So when we spike the vegetation up, we actually see an initial pulse, an increase in rainfall, but that, of course, also deteriorates as the vegetation returns back. The more challenging situation is this. So these three graphs are decreases in vegetation. So they would be associated with clearing or desertification or some kind of land degradation associated with maybe more intensive cattle grazing or browsing. At some levels of decrease, you can get back, and the climate will go with you. And other levels of decrease, and these thresholds are relatively small when we think about the kinds of manipulations that could actually occur. There are fine lines where at some point you might not be able to return back to the condition. And that's fundamentally of a different kind of character than the way we think about ecosystems in, say, temperate United States, where we all have a feeling, we're reaping some of the benefits of this right now, that if you take 200 years of agriculture and put it out of production, you'll start seeing a forest regrowing there. And we'll get some carbon sequestration even out of something like that. That just may not happen. I can't say that it wouldn't, but it's possible that there are some irreversible shifts in landscapes that just are unrecoverable and propagate actually into the climate. Okay, so there's some really important issues there. So just to close, I want to just reemphasize what's going to fill these boxes as we think about development. Certainly protected and recreational lands are important for ecotourism. We're going to see massive increases in population in urban areas in these regions, especially if this box gets filled with land degradation, because the people that are here on these subsistence lands are going to be moving into urban areas if we cannot maintain the landscapes that they live in now. And just to kind of close and bring this point really home, I work a lot in Botswana, which is a landlocked country in southern Africa, for those of you that aren't familiar with the geography. The currency in Botswana is the pula. The pula is, so that's the national currency. Pula is the Setswana word for rain. So in these places, the interactions between the economy and the environment, the physical environment, in this case water, are really inseparable. And so with that that's how, one thing that I'd like you to think about as we go forward with this panel, and as you think about the challenges of development is how do you separate the economic and social development from the environmental situation that a lot of these countries find themselves in, and the situations that we don't yet even understand that they might be experiencing in the future. Okay, so with that, hopefully we can start to merge in this panel, and as we go forward with the Grand Challenges Initiative, we can start bringing these separate aspects of the things I just talked about into the other aspects of policy and wildlife conservation. So with that, I'd like to start actually, turn it over to the panel itself. Our first speaker today is Julius Coles, and I guess that's just going to be there. He received his MPA from the Woodrow Wilson School in 1966 and has had an incredibly distinguished career working with USAID and Foreign Service. He's currently the president of Africare, and in his work with USAID, has actually was the mission director at Senegal and in Swaziland, also had posts in Vietnam, Morocco, Liberia, and Nepal. In 2007, so just last year, received the James Madison Award from Princeton University, also received the Presidential Meritorious Service Award, and I thought it was really interesting looking at his bio. I'd like to hear more about sometime. It was awarded the Commander in the Order of the Lion by the President of Senegal. So I'm very happy to have you here and talking with us today about development. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kelly. It's really wonderful to be back at Princeton, as it always is. And before I begin my remarks, I'd just like to pay a small tribute to President Robert Goheen, a man that opened this university to minority students and to diversity. And I just would not have been here if it had not been for his vision. And I just really feel very sad to come to Princeton at a time when I read the Princeton Weekly and he's on the cover as having been deceased. I just want to say that he was a very special person, and thank him for what he's done for this university. And I think that he will be remembered as one of the great presidents of this great institution. And I just want to say thank you, wherever you may be. Thank you. I also want to thank Dean Nolan McCarthy for the opportunity to come back to Princeton, and to Professor Daniel Rubenstein, the chair of the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, who invited me to come. When he first invited me to come here, I was a little bit reluctant. So this is an area that I don't consider myself to be an expert on. And coming back to Princeton and being with scientists and engineers, I felt a little bit timid and intimidated. But I can see that I'm in a friendly environment, so I'm not going to let that worry me. I'm going to try to do the best I can on what I consider to be a very important subject covering the continent of Africa. I must say that I enjoyed looking at your slides because I didn't bring any slides with me, but I think they really point out the problems that Africa is experiencing in terms of environmental issues. When I look at those charts on demography and I look at the charts on the rainfall and everything else, it just seems to bring home the difficulty of the African environmental situation and the impact that it's having on the people and on the economic development of the continent as a whole. I've spent some 46 years of my life working on Africa. That's a long time. I think for some of the people in the audience, it might be a little bit longer than they have lived. So I feel somewhat ancient. And the fact that I say that I went to Princeton in the 1960s, I don't find too many of us around any longer, but it's kind of nice to be back and to think about that, and then to reflect on that amount of experience on working on this fantastic continent that I've learned to love and to enjoy for most of my career. In 2007, the African Economic Outlook, a publication of the African Development Bank, stated that African countries over the past 5 years had grown by some 5.4%. When you think about Africa after a period of independence, for some 30 to 40 years, African economic growth was negative, or just slightly positive, of 1%. And in the past 5 to 10 years alone, at least 34 countries in Africa had a growth rate of more than 5%. I think that's a phenomenal change in the situation, and it gives some hope in terms of possibilities of this vast continent that is not a continually hopeless situation. When we look at our own country's growth, it is nowhere near that. But at the same time, we can say, unfortunately, that a lot of this growth is due to mineral exploration and oil exploration, and that has fueled a lot of the growth. But we can look at other countries that I think do have sound economic policies and good management and good leadership, and that has brought about a phenomenal change on the African continent. But nevertheless, a lot of that growth is being experienced because of the richness of the mineral resources and the exploitation of oil and other fossil fuels that are abundant on the African continent. In spite of all this positive signal in terms of development, Africa still is one of the poorest, and is the poorest region in the whole world. It's a very sort of interesting to look, and when people talk about the new Millennium Development Goals, and they say, what are we going to accomplish for these goals for the whole world by 2015? Experts in the field reluctantly conclude that Africa is not going to make it, and that we're going to have to make some adjustments to our targets and goals for the continent of Africa. And recently, while I was abroad, I just came back the night before last from Southern Africa and East Africa, and there was a UNESCO and a United Nations report that reluctantly had reached this conclusion also, that Africa was not going to make the Millennium Development Goals. So what does this say to us? Let's say that it talks a lot about how optimistic people were about what could be achieved, and yet at the same time how unrealistic these goals were in terms of how they were established. And there are a lot of people like Jeffrey Sachs and others who will debate whether the goals were appropriate or not. But I think most of us would agree that they were really unrealistic and have to be adjusted for the future. Let's look at the poverty of Africa. There are some 600 million people that live on less than $2 a day. 600 million people. And there are expected to rise to some 400 million by 2015. So that's not very far away. In addition, we say that there are some 210 million people who live on less than $1 a day. I think those are phenomenal and amazing statistics to give you some idea of the real poverty being experienced on the African continent. If Africa is to achieve its long-term development objectives and to have sustainable development, most people believe that something has to be done to lessen the heavy reliance on natural resources and the implications that this might have on the African environment. If Africa continues to exploit its natural resources at the level that it is doing now, it will have serious adverse implications for future generations to come. And I think your slides point that out in terms of the continuing environmental degradation that is being spent on the African continent, that it's time to take note of these problems and to seek how we might be able to promote sustainable development that is ecologically friendly for the African continent as a whole. Let us take a look at what are some of the challenges to sustainable development in Africa. According to the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, indicators of overall sustainability encompassing economic, environmental, and institutional dimensions show that African economies are less sustainable today than they were 25 years ago. Less sustainable today than they were 25 years ago. At the end of 2000, more than half the population of the 38 countries assessed lived in economies with low overall sustainability. And what I would like to do in my remarks today is to look at the reasons why this is the case for the continent of Africa. One of the reasons I think I've already mentioned, and that is the question of extreme poverty. As I stated earlier, poverty remains the foremost development challenge confronting Africa. Poverty in Africa is linked to the environment in complex ways, particularly in natural resource-based African economies, in that about 2/3 of the population live in rural areas, deriving their income mainly from agriculture. From the arid zones of the northern fringes of West Africa to the thick forests of the Congo basin up to and highlands of East Africa, my organization, Africare, has seen how the poor strive to pursue livelihoods with little options outside what they can offer. Trees are cut for fuel wood, land-degrading farming systems have been adopted, wildlife are being hunted to extinction, all in an effort to satisfy today's pressing livelihood needs. I've just returned, as I said earlier, from a trip to Southern and East Africa, and I could see the impact of the environment in the country of Tanzania, where I visited, and people talk about the Kilimanjaro ecosystem and what is happening there with regard to climate change. You can also see in the Serengeti the migration of animals to more fertile grasslands, and it's really having an economic impact, not only in terms of ecotourism, but for development in general, and even on the welfare of the animals that are in that area. Another problem is the environmental performance of extractive industries. I see that we had a representative from ExxonMobil with us here before, and many of the American oil companies are very actively engaged in development and in exploitation of Africa's natural resources. We can also see that there is also a very large giant looming on the horizon called China that's coming in to Africa to even exploit those resources with greater fervency and demand like no one has ever seen. And the implications of what the Chinese are doing and what they plan to do and what they are doing will have long-term implications on the continent as a whole. But for a continent that is dependent on its natural resources to achieve growth, the challenge of sustainable development is daunting. Current patterns of extraction of non-renewable resources such as gold, diamonds, crude oil have had an unfold impact on the environment. In Nigeria alone, oil spills and gas fires have polluted the environment considerably for more than 50 years. The 2008 target set forth for the elimination of glass flaring increasingly appears to be impossible to achieve. Southern Africa, abandoned mines sites have constituted an environmental menace. The loss of productive land, surface and groundwater pollution, soil contamination are part of the legacies of oil and mineral resource exploration. Africa cannot afford the current approach to resource extraction. If the trend of unsustainable mineral and oil extraction is allowed to continue, environmentally sustainable development in Africa will continue to be a great challenge and will probably, in the long run, continue to be highly negative. Another factor impacting on this situation is Africa's population growth rate. According to the World Bank, the sub-Saharan population is growing at a rate of 2.5% per year as compared to 1.2% in Latin America and Asia. At that rate, Africa's population would double in 30 years. rapid population growth rate has put a lot of stress on Africa ecosystems. Problems such as food security, land tenure, environmental degradation, and the lack of water supply are often related to this whole question of high population growth rates. Another major problem is that of rapid urbanization. A majority of Africa's population growth is expected to take place in urban areas, largely due to rural-urban migrations. Rapid urbanization in Africa has been accompanied by new and challenging environmental problems. A sizable portion of urban dwellers in sub-Saharan Africa live under slum conditions without durable housing or legal rights to their land. At least 1/4 of African city dwellers do not have access to electricity. A 2000 World Health Organization report estimated that only 43% of urban dwellers had access to piped water. Nearly a decade later, not much has changed. Waste disposal presents a tremendous health hazard in many urban areas. In Kibera, Nairobi's largest slum, plastic bags are used as flying toilets. Clearly, current patterns of urbanization are not consistent with the desire to have an ecologically friendly, sustainable development situation in Africa. I just attended the Woodrow Wilson School Advisory Committee, and I see that many of my colleagues are in the audience, so I feel very good to see them here, giving me moral support through this lecture. But one of the things that was discussed, which I was surprised at, was the whole question of garbage collection in Africa, which is a major problem. And it's a problem that the Woodrow Wilson School is getting involved in. I think that's quite a commendable thing, because certainly garbage collection in Africa is a major problem and a major concern when it comes to environmental issues. Then there's the whole question of deforestation. According to the African Forest Forum, Africa has about 650 million hectares of forests and woodlands, covering 28% of its total land area. The Congo Basin, which covers 45% of Central Africa, is the world's largest area of contiguous forest. Sadly, this legacy of vast forest resources could have been passed on to future generations is now being lost very rapidly through deforestation and environmental degradation. Between 1990 and 2000, Africa lost about 53 million hectares of its forests, which is about 56% of the global forest loss in that period. 56% of the global forest lost in that period. This is translated to 0.8% annual loss of forest cover, the highest in the world. And I would like to ask Kelly, what is the implication of that? That is really a dramatic change when you think about it. As the forests disappear, so is its contribution to the protection of soils, the recycling of nutrients, and the regulation of the quality and flow of water. A recent Africare study in Tanzania confirms that the water catchment functions of the Kilimanjaro Mountains is being threatened by severe deforestation, non-ecological tourism, and land clearing for economic purposes to support the growing population on the Kilimanjaro highlands. Another serious problem confronting the African environment is the whole question of climatic variability and natural environmental hazards. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change studies have suggested that Africa will suffer from the effects of climate change more than any region of the world. Predictions include the decrease in rainfall in the already arid areas of eastern southern Africa and in the north and central Africa, increasing drought and desertification. In West Africa alone, the countries of Benin, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Mauritania, Niger, and Nigeria will all face severe water scarcity by 2025. It is without a doubt a statement that says Africa needs to step up its anti-climate change actions as a legacy to future generations. However, many African countries do not have this as a top priority in view of the pressing development challenges being confronted by the continent with such issues as HIV/AIDS, malaria, and poor agricultural production. In some of the literature that I was reading, they were predicting in some parts of southern Africa as much as a 25% reduction in agricultural production, already in an area that is pretty much agricultural and food deficit. So the implications of climate change for Africa are very severe. Another thing that I learned, and I'd be interested in other experts who might have some ideas on this, deals with the whole questions of how Africans are brought into these international bodies. And in the literature that I've read, one of the complaints coming out of the African governments is that the African governments have not been involved in the actual drafting of many of the international agreements. These have been dominated by the more developed countries and industrialized countries and Asian countries, but have had little African participation. And yet Africans are being asked to take and say that these are their own. And the Africans are beginning to rebel that they need to be more involved in these kinds of agreements. And I think that this is something that I think should be looked at. Coming out of this and all these problems, the question is, what kind of solutions do you have? And being a graduate of the Woodrow Wilson School, you can't put problems out there without coming up with some suggestions as to how they might be addressed. So I would like to throw some ideas out as to some of the things that might be done to try to address these issues that are very important. The first one, I think we need to take some time and look at the actions that might be taken, and I believe that one of the most important ones is the whole question of strengthening Africa's capacity to implement multilateral environmental agreements. African countries are signatories to most multilateral environmental agreements that showcase global consensus on the causes and effects of environmental changes. Examples include the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Montreal Protocols, the Convention to Combat Desertification, and many others. However, oftentimes, in addition to not participating in the development of many of these agreements, they have lacked the capacity to implement these agreements or to honor the commitments therein. So donor nations like United Nations and United States, the International Fund for Reconstruction and Development, the World Bank, the Global Environmental Fund, I think, has to devote more resources to training more manpower to be able to carry out the various protocols and to help African nations do this. There's also the whole question of providing assistance to improve the effectiveness of institutions. African countries need to demonstrate their capacity to be able to tackle these challenges. Most of the countries in Africa have established environmental institutions, and along with them, the legislative basis and administrative procedures for environmental management. However, progress is limited by lack of adequate human, technical, and financial resources, and ineffective institutional arrangements. And very often, the quest for foreign direct investment often leads to compromises in strict enforcement of environmental laws. This tends to perpetuate the unsustainability of resource patterns on the African continent. i.e., it comes down to sacrificing your country and your environmental heritage for profit and for exploitation of resources in the hope that they will result in providing more income to carry out development activities. At the national level, I think there is a need to develop a capacity to carry out strategic environmental assessments. And that's something that's been lacking on the African continent. Africans have been willing to do environmental assessments for projects, but have not been able to carry out the strategic environmental assessments of looking at the total picture of the environment as it impacts on their countries. Finally, I believe that African governments also need to engage the private sector effectively to provide business solutions to environmental challenges. Not only should they engage the private sector in terms of talking about how they go about exploiting the natural resources in Africa, but taking the technology and the knowledge available in the private sector to see that it can be put to productive uses to help solve some of Africa's environmental problems. In conclusion, I believe that in the long term, economically friendly, ecologically development in Africa is possible, but it's going to take a long time before that is achieved. I hope that my remarks have provided some insights to some of the problems confronting the African countries as they seek to overcome their environmental problems. But I look forward to the discussion of the issues that I have raised and other people will raise, because I think there we will get into a more challenging, interesting dialogue on what I consider to be one of the significant problems confronting the African continent. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So our second speaker today is Joshua Ginsberg. Joshua is currently the Vice President for Conservation Operations with the Wildlife Conservation Society. He received both his MA and PhD from the EEB department here at Princeton, and has spent 15 years as a biologist and conservationist working in Africa. He's held faculty positions at Oxford University and the University College in London, and we're very happy to have him here talk with us today about some of his work on conservation. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks,
I have no idea if we can get this to work.
We'll see if we can get this to work or
So
not.
we need
Because
to-
unlike Julius, I'm not sufficiently self-confident to,
Well, I know how to do it from
once
here.
we do, go into colloquium. Oops. And then go there. Excellent. And then,
Perfect.
good. And I bet if I hit something here, it will make it go forward or back. Yeah, okay, it rolls. I'm going to sort of go from the sort of large-scale, continent-wide issues that Julius looked at and sort of go down to what might be sublime or ridiculous. Almost everything I'm going to talk about once I get through my introduction are examples of what is possible, but I recognize that the scale at which I am discussing these things is irrelevant to solving the problems. That said, so much of what has been discussed in terms of the relationship between environment and development, and particularly biodiversity conservation and development, has made the simplifying assumption either at one end that it's simple, there are win-win solutions, and we just need to keep going as we're going, or it's impossible, nothing's going to work, water's declining, productivity's declining, we're going to have greater civil conflict as a result of resource demands and also conflicts over resources themselves. And so it sort of seems to be polarized. So I just wanted to use examples from programs that I'm familiar with rather than just combing the literature for generalities to see if I could say something that would give people hope. Just so people understand the definition of a conservation biologist. I used to say it was somebody who thought the glass was 1/8 full. I'm getting less demanding. It's now the glass only needs to be about 1/16 full to be optimistic. All right. as we've discussed before, the human footprint in Africa, measured by overlays of roads, villages, and human access and use in various ways, permanent lights at night data. But this footprint is not a biological or ecological footprint. It's a development and human footprint. And the footprint is, getting stronger. Humans have been in the equation in Africa since we were. But clearly our dynamics and relationship with Africa are changing. The influence is changing both in terms of its breadth and depth. People are in more places at higher densities doing more things than ever before. As Julius has pointed out in 7 different ways, development is critical. You cannot keep people at this level of poverty or worse. And so if we're going to change the trajectory of conservation in Africa, we also have to change the trajectory of development. So what are the prospects for conservation? Well, this graph, I think, says a lot. I looked at some data from OECD and the bank and other places to just try and see where overseas development assistance and overseas direct investment were in terms of relationship to each other. And this is the Wilson School. People will argue with me about whether I got it right or not. But generally speaking, direct investment from the private sector is now just squeaking over the investment from overseas development assistance. Africa gets about 1/4 of the world's global aid. Global aid since the mid-90s has been increasing. That's good news. But the proportion of overseas development investment, direct investment, has gone up much faster, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years. And as Julius again mentioned, most of that is in the natural resource extraction fields. But it is growing, and it is growing fast. That thin little sliver is from an unpublished study that I am not going to mention because I'm not supposed to be citing it yet, on the investment of major conservation organizations, both global, national, and local, on conservation activities in Africa. And if the ODA and the ODI are each about $30 or $40 billion a year, depending on the year, the investment on conservation issues that are focused just on conservation or focused on development but through conservation, it's about $100 million to $150 million a year. So even if we ramp that up in order of magnitude and say there's a lot of ODA that goes into development activities that has a positive conservation benefit, it's still a 0 or 2 off the end of what's going in to development and investment in infrastructure development and extraction and all those other activities, which means that we really don't have much choice if we're going to do this. We're going to have to work both with development and with industry. Right? That conservationists cannot just sit back and do these small-scale projects, and unless we start to figure out ways to start mainstreaming these, and that can be through development of relationships with organizations that are out there doing development and working with them to have better approaches to sustainability, or working with the industries. And working with American industries actually is easy. As Julia said, trying to work with Chinese industry, which we've done in a couple places in Africa. Recently we've made an attempt in Gabon. We've been trying to do it in southern Africa, and it's very, very difficult. The cultural differences are surely displayed by the lack of convergence on the issues related to the movement of the Olympic torch. But it is a symbolic issue, and it really shows that there just is a whole different set of criteria that are being used, and conservation is not clearly one of them. All right, where have we come from? Conservation and development have been placed in opposition for about 30 years. And that conflict between those two activities, I think, is in some ways an intellectual problem. We started out when we tried to do conservation and development together with what I call the donut in the hole. And this picture, I just put it up because I liked it. It's actually a lake in the middle of a forest, but it's a very big lake in Congo, and it's in the middle of a very big forest still. But it's an example, because the lake is a protected area and the forest is not, of what I would call the donut in the hole. The whole of the donut is a protected area. And in this case, it's a communally managed protected area. But the protected area has much more stringent resource management, much less extractive, and really sort of protectionist in sort of the old sense of the word. The donut itself would be a buffer area. And, the buffer area would have some level of management. But the idea was you have this core inviolate, or if it is violated or if it's used, managed very closely area, and then around it you'd have a buffer area, and then around that the rest of the world. And the problem with that is that it took a disjunction between conservation as protection and development as use. right? And as a result of that, what would happen generally is because the outside area was more loosely managed with fewer controls, either social controls or government controls, you would end up degrading the buffer area, and then the tension for resources amplified in the donut hole. Right? And so the buffer zone, the donut and the donut hole didn't really work very well, and there were limited successes. There is a poor literature because this was started in the late 70s, mid to late 70s, and there wasn't a real focus as there is today on monitoring and evaluation. And certainly one of the things that's come out of the business community and into the nonprofit world in the last decade, mainly I think at the instigation of some major private donors, is that you really have to get out there and measure. And then in the old days you might have put 3, 4, 5% of your budget into monitoring and evaluation, and now it's creeping up to 8, 10, 12%. And that's not a bad thing because we're learning from that. Okay. So the second sort of major phase started in the early 80s and really took root in the mid-late 80s, and that was the ICDP, or the Integrated Conservation and Development Program. And that was the first attempt to try and get this idea of doing development and conservation in the same place at the same time, rather than having a disjunct set of activities spatially. The idea was that if you did development that was sustainable, it would necessarily be good for the environment, particularly for biodiversity. This was advocated most strongly by the World Conservation Union. When they started out, they were the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, IUCN. They kept their acronym but changed their name. And the World Conservation Union, through the World Conservation Strategy and then the World Parks Congress Declaration in 1982, and finally a document called Caring for the Earth, made what I think was a naive and simplistic assumption that if we did good development, we would get good conservation. And I think there's not, again, a lot of analytical work, but integrating conservation and development led to two things. It tended to maximize the development focus, because most of the ICDP programs started out as development programs and then added in conservation as an added benefit. Right? And so for the most part, if you go out and evaluate these, and the best evaluations were done by the bank in Indonesia, where they had a huge portfolio in Sumatra that they started in the mid-'80s, and then they evaluated a decade later. There's been some work by World Wildlife Fund. Jeff Sayer just published a paper last year in which they said, look, the development targets are fairly well met. Right? These are good development programs that have been well designed. They had clear goals and objectives, and to some extent, they've done a fairly good job, maybe 60, 70% success, which in this business is very good. The conservation targets were less well defined, less well met, and seemed to be sacrificed. And some collaborations, we were involved with one I remember with CARE in Uganda, where the budget was managed by CARE. When the budget got cut fairly significantly because of an appropriation falling through, or an obligation not being made after the appropriation fell through, the conservation activities were cut back, first because after all this was a development program to begin with. I don't know how indicative that is of the whole problem, but I think it was a significant piece of it. So where are we now? I like to use the term living landscapes. And this is sort of taking the conservation and development idea and flipping it on the head a little bit and saying, let's start looking at the problem with at least an equal partnership from the point of view of wildlife and wild places and people. Right? And so we've got to start looking at management not as a donut hole and then the donut around it, not as a development project and the add-on benefits of conservation, but saying, okay, what does wildlife need to persist? What do we know from research and from expert knowledge and other forms of information that tell us how wildlife persists? What do we know about people and people in a landscape and how they live and what their needs are? And then let's overlay those two things and say, okay, where are the conflict areas and how do we resolve them? This does two things. It takes it into an area which I like as a scientist, which is saying data are important. But it also allows us to say, okay, once we have those data, we don't need to manage the whole system. What we need is to manage the areas where there are conflicts and or competing uses. So you look at the biological landscape, and you might, in this case, and I don't think I have do I do have a pointer? Is this going to point? No, it's a pen. You might have, from a wildlife perspective, preferred food resources and breeding habitats and refuges and secondary food resources. And these are all very schematic, but you'll get the idea. And from the human landscape, you're going to have political boundaries, so you'll have a couple of different countries. You might have an indigenous reserve, term used more in Latin America than in Africa, a protected area, agricultural work fields, extractive industry, and they're spatially disjunct from each other. The networks of infrastructure that support them will, of course, overlap and will be another factor that you look at. If you start overlaying these things, what you're going to find is there are places where human activities like hunting may limit movement and behavior of animals. Development of roads may change the dynamics of animals. We know from research in Africa, you put a road in, elephants behave differently. Right? They just move away from it. Right? Agriculture may have an impact on breeding habitat, reducing breeding habitat. Is this important? Well, that's going to depend how large the population is, what functionality really is in the population, and what you want to get out of it. It may be that a wildlife population or a set of wildlife populations can withstand quite a bit of perturbation, and that the impact will vary depending on seasonality, whether the use is concurrent in time and space, and so on and so forth. You can then look at interventions that might change this dynamic. And I'm going to just skip over this pretty quickly, but you get the idea of sort of managing at a landscape scale. All right, I want to pick a few examples. I threw out a bunch of examples because I was told I had a very set amount of time, and now I'm told I have more time. So I may bring in reference to some of those. The first one is in northern Congo. The map, I love these maps. We just started making them. They're really helpful. They show where you are. They do an explosion. But then they take New York State, which certainly in this environment most people know, and start to show the scale of working in Africa. Right? These landscapes are big. Right? And New York State is not huge, it's not the biggest state, but it's pretty big. And when you start to see these places put onto that map, it gives you an idea of the extent of the area that people live and work in and just how big these problems are, because most of these areas have poor infrastructure, poor access, and are difficult to work in, and that affects development as well as conservation. Now, in Ndoki, we've been working there for about 25 years in different ways. We helped set up a national park there. We've been working in the buffer zone. We helped establish a community reserve in that lake that I showed you the picture of. But I want to focus on one project, which is a somewhat odd one for a conservation organization. The Congolais Industriels de Bois is a large, formerly Belgian, I can't remember who bought them out last month, but I think it was a French company bought them out, logging company. And they came to us because they said, look, we would like to do something to change the dynamics of wildlife conservation and forestry. And so we started a program in the mid-90s that tried to look at how one would manage wildlife in the landscape. And the challenge was, to take a production forest, and usually production forests strip the landscape of their resources. Now, in Central Africa, and particularly interior Congo Basin, most of what's being done now is very selective logging. They don't clear fell because, getting the timber out costs more than the value of the timber. So only very high value timber is going out. But bringing in roads, bringing in people, gives access to wildlife. You then develop market chains that bring you back to villages and towns and capital cities. Bushmeat moves out of their area to the tune of about 1 billion kilos, or what is that, 1 million metric tons a year. Right? And so trying to maintain controls over that and manage the landscape has a tremendous advantage for wildlife, and that was our first focus. So the approach was to manage wildlife in the concession areas themselves and have the logging company take responsibility for that management. The result was greater persistence of wildlife by several orders of magnitude in the productive areas. And as a result of that, we think greater persistence of the forest because there actually is a relationship long-term between seed dispersal, forest regeneration, and wildlife. Now, I'm going to come really clean. People were not in this equation originally. Our organization, Congolais Industriels de Bois, and the government of Congo got hit very hard for either real or perceived impacts on a very small population of indigenous people, pygmies, who used the land and moved around on a semi-nomadic basis. The problem I'm trying to remember the author, my name. There's an article last year by, Brockington in Conservation Biology. Dan Brockington's an anthropologist in England, and he pointed out that while the implicit assumption is that with nomadic peoples, changing the dynamics of access to resources is going to have a large impact, the problem is that up until the late 80s, anthropologists themselves didn't have a real construct intellectually to look at those changes, and we've done a lousy job of measuring it. But I'm going to just make the simplifying assumption that we did a bad thing as an institution and say what's been done since. Well, CIB, Congolais Industriels de Bois, was doing so well in terms of getting added value for their timber that they decided to go for FSC, Forest Stewardship Council certification, and it's the first concession in Central Africa with that certification. Articles 2 and 3 of that certification require that indigenous and local people are brought into the decision-making process, that the impacts are mitigated, and that generally the program is done in a way that has minimal impacts on local people and indigenous people. The Greenpeace did a report in 2002 that pretty well slammed CIB, said, look, they're starting to get to the right place and they're trying, but they're nowhere near there. And by 2005, the Forest Peoples Project from the UK came out and said, look, they're not doing it perfectly, but they're doing it a heck of a lot better. And, they still said, I'm not sure we'd give them FSC certification, but with enough change by 2007, that was then granted. And the reason I bring this up is, it's not perfect, but, initially poor engagement led to a process where the company themselves saw value on their bottom line of certification. The external certification process forced them to deal with an issue, in this case, people, which they had tried to avoid. They'd done perhaps a better job in some circumstances than many commercial forestry companies who have a very bad reputation, as was discussed before. But the reality here is that we are all learning. Now, the answer to this is the best managed, from my perspective, and I think many people's perspectives, industrial forestry activity in Central Africa. I think we have to look at how that forest is being harvested and try and mitigate that to the best we can. But I use it as an example of, yes, you can do better both for people and for wildlife. All right, going to move on. It's not perfect, but it's the best one we got. Another example of doing that is this whole category, and of course, talking about environmentally friendly, key to my brain, this idea that's been developing on wildlife-friendly products. And again, this is a certification process, and so my connection between the last project and this one is the issue of certification and also added value to products. And the idea is to develop and market products that are certified to be more friendly to wildlife than the alternatives, and also directly contribute to the economic vitality of rural communities. I'm going to focus on one just because it's really easy, and that's the Elephant Pepper Company. And the reason there's a picture of elephants up there and they're named the Elephant Pepper Company is elephants really don't like chilies. Right? Anybody who's spent time around elephants know that the end of the trunk is a very, very sensitive organ, and if it touches capsicum, it really, really doesn't like it. And so we are working with groups, and the Elephant Pepper Company is an independent organization, actually has a close relationship to the Tabasco Company, family member relationships, and working to develop a situation in which we try and reduce elephant crop rating around areas, protected areas, by adding in buffer crops of chili peppers. Now, sounds strange, but capsicum is actually a natural product whose value is increasing quite rapidly. It's being used as an anti-fouling agent on boats because the alternatives are all heavy metals, and we're trying to move away from that. It's being marketed, of course, we know we eat a lot more hot sauce now than we used to. Globally, that's the issue. This strategy is being used in Asia, but interestingly enough, the strain of peppers in Africa doesn't grow the same level of Schofield values. Schofield values are chili pepper heat. Right, so anybody who's a chili addict know that a Schofield value of 22 is really hot, and you take the same peppers from Africa and move them to Asia, and it doesn't grow the same way. So you have to take a Thai pepper called pricky nu, which means mouse shit peppers, and they're very, very hot, and you grow them instead. So it's an evolving process, but it's actually growing. The result with wildlife is reduced impact and reduced mortality of elephants, because in the old days, the way to deal with crop-raiding elephants was to shoot them. And this is a good alternative. With humans, the result was increased income. You've reduced the supply chain. You've improved. There's a lot of agricultural outreach and work being done to improve the quality of the crop. And by shipping it directly into better markets, you're getting higher value. And as a result, you're also getting improved food security of those crops because the crop rating's dropped. Right? I would have had a whole set of slides on a project in Zambia that we've been doing with NORAD and the World Food Program and a couple of other organizations, looking at taking this idea and doing two things, one of which is expanding it into other crops, but also moving the marketing locally. And so the idea is to produce certified and branded products called It's Wild in Zambia for consumption in Zambia. And there's enough of a market for that so that by reducing the supply chain, developing cooperatives, and reducing the impact on wildlife, there seems to be an ability to not just market globally, but to market nationally. That all got cut out, so that's 5 slides in 1 sentence or 2 sentences. Okay. Want to talk about 2 more projects? Do I have time, Kelly? Okay. One in Ruaha. This is the link back to water. Challenge there was the permanent water source, the Great Ruaha River, which is important to people for agriculture, both small-scale agriculture and rice agriculture, wet rice agriculture. It is important to the government because it produces electricity off hydropower, and it's really important to wildlife because it's the major river running through a very large game wildlife area, both in the Runga-Ruaha National Park and in game reserves around it, hunting reserves and other reserves. You're getting, as a result of the Ruaha River drying up episodically, you are getting a collapse of ecosystem function. So this is the Mtara Reservoir in 1984, and there's a bit of fudge going on here because the years are not quite exactly right in terms of rainfall, but they're close enough. By 2006, you'd lost a tremendous amount of area, about 2/3, 3/4 of the reservoir had dropped. That has a big effect on a lot of things. Obviously, it has an effect on power generation, but it also has a big effect on livelihoods. The area of the reservoir declined, but also if you look at the fisheries data, basically the fisheries collapsed. Right? And so there's a direct relation on commercial fisheries, which are mainly for local protein there. There's also a direct a direct loss to wildlife. And so, again, I pulled the slide, but the range of buffalo, African buffalo in the region has condensed and we believe collapsed. Hippopotamus have been very badly affected by this. I have a student who just went out and said, what's interesting is crop rating by hippos has declined because there are fewer hippos. Right? So the challenge was no water. The improvement is improved management of water resources, both on the commercial and smallholder side. This has just started in 2006. The result, however, already is starting to see some recovery in wildlife. Again, it's going to be a decade or two because wildlife, 3-4% growth a year. It's going to take a decade or two to see real recovery. And from the human perspective, there's more energy being generated. There's the potential for improved livelihoods, and rice production can go up. As Bob Zellick said yesterday in front of a lot of people, the cost of rice is rising quickly. And so if Tanzania can't improve their own rice production, they're going to end up in a deficit situation as well as much of Asia. All right, finally, I want to end up with carbon, right? Everybody believes that carbon is the answer to all the environmental problems, and the voluntary markets for carbon are going to solve everything. You can tell by the way I say it, I don't believe that. However, it is probably the biggest game in town. I don't know if people listen to NPR. I can't remember. It was earlier this week. I think it was earlier this week, Monday or Tuesday morning. They were saying that all the hotshots who in my day went to Bear Stearns all are going into carbon trading. Right? Young graduates, the Wilson School or Harvard Business School or somewhere else, all sort of end up into it because it's ecologically good, it's it's economically great. So let's talk about. I would like to talk. In this whole area of northeastern Madagascar is one of the last good forests. I mean, Madagascar has been very heavily hammered. 90% loss of forest, huge population issues, food security issues. This northeast area, from the Mashwal area up through Makere, is an area that has a lot of people in it. 100,000 people in and around Makere, which is a carbon reserve now. And Mashwal has about 40,000 people in and around the protected area. But for Madagascar, that's not a very high population density, but it is a very, very large block of forest. And in Makere, there's about, I think I got it here, about 9 million metric tons of marketable carbon. So the challenge is how do you market that carbon, protect biodiversity, and deliver benefits equitably? Right? What we're looking at is sort of boutique carbon or triple benefit carbon, right? And so you get some sort of ecosystem management and sustainable development, climate mitigation, biodiversity impacts, so positive biodiversity impacts, and improved livelihood. So it's triple certified carbon. There's an organization that's looking at climate, community, and biodiversity standards, CCB, and the idea there is in the voluntary markets, just doing the mitigation isn't enough because, of course, it's voluntary. This isn't really a tradable asset. This is a feel-good asset. This is I want to offset the drive. I came up here. My car gets 47 miles to the gallon. I drove 52 miles. I have to offset a gallon of gas, right, each way. And so I go online and I buy some offsets. Those are voluntary. They really don't have any true value. But if you're going to market these things, you actually have to be able to verify them. You also want some insurance. So if, the carbon, the leakage doesn't, you can't stop the leakage, the trees get cut down, that there's a biodiversity value and a human development value means that whoever's buying this sort of sees a 3-for-1 buy. So not only are they offsetting their carbon, but they're doing good things for the environment and good things for people. All right? So the idea also is that co-benefits, right, for people support the additionality because they reduce the leakage. Right? And so by demonstrating a causality between these different pieces, you can improve the potential for the program to work. All right? The approach is to establish transparent and effective distribution and management of income. Right? And anybody knows, I mean, Julius talked about land tenure, but land tenure and money and the distribution of money, if you look at a project like the Campfire Project in Zimbabwe, which up until recently, maybe 6 years ago, before Zimbabwe collapsed economically, was doing an interesting and in some places very good job of transferring assets to local communities through wildlife hunting, to the point where a member of parliament said, why are all these poor people getting all this money? I considered that, it's in the Financial Times of Zimbabwe, and I thought that was the best indicator of success when politicians are saying, no, this money shouldn't be going locally, it should be coming to us. So there was enough money, so they were worrying about it. But in any of these large-scale issues, training people, there's nobody right now. I mean, Madagascar's got some phenomenal bureaucrats. I mean, really, not just well-educated, but savvy, globally clever people. But there's nobody there who's really trained on marketing carbon and what that means and how one measures it. And, if we're going to start getting into carbon as an issue, capacity-building programs for governments across the continent so they don't get ripped off is really important, either by NGOs or by private sector. And so what we've done is we're working with the government in Makira and with Conservation International to develop a revenue distribution for the sale of 9.5 million tons, which at today's market price gives you about $50 million. Now remember I said the total investment annually in conservation activities in Africa by NGOs is $120 million. So on a scale for folks like us, that's a lot of money. If you work for Goldman Sachs, it's not. Right? But how it's a lot of money in northeast Madagascar. And so 50% of that is going to go to the local communities. But to do that, we have to, how do you manage it? When we say the local communities, who is it, what level, how do you allocate it? So fortunately, there's a group called Tanimeva, which is a local financial management and development NGO, just got a nice award from the MacArthur Foundation for being a wonderful group of people. But Tanimeva is going to manage this. They get 5% for the local management costs. 25% is going to protected area management and to Elfatih, the department that manages the two reserves. 10% is going to the Ministry of Elfatih just for carbon finance unit to help build that capacity so they can not only manage this but other carbon deals. And then 5% is going for monitoring and verification because you have to do that to keep the buyers happy, and 5% for marketing. That's our cut. Right? So the whole distribution on this, 50% of it is going, we hope, to local communities. And then not only figuring out how to do that, which is Tanimeva's, I would say, problem or challenge, but also trying to ensure that people know that the development that they are receiving is the result of not cutting trees and therefore a conservation linkage. Right? And that is where this whole ICDP or donut in the hole problem really came about, because there was no linkage. And so you have to have that linkage. Right? Biodiversity benefits, it's going to maintain connectivity among the largest block of forest remaining in Madagascar. This is a hugely biodiversity rich area. It has 1%, it represents 1% of the world's biodiversity. It's got 20 species of endangered lemur, the serpent, Malagasy serpent eagle, plus another 100 species. The fusa, which is this wonderful little carnivore, is a lovely and amazing place. It also has the world's most remarkable butterflies. Claire Kremen, who used to be on faculty here, another recipient of a MacArthur Award, this time the Genius Award, started the Mashwal Reserve through her work on butterflies. So it's an amazingly important area. From the human perspective, it's going to ensure the integrity of the ecosystem services, particularly watersheds and the resultant fisheries that several 100,000 people will rely on in the future. It's got a very large extension component to it, so it's going to improve agricultural practices, we hope, reducing TAVI, which is the cut, slash, and burn agriculture, and trying to better manage that. And it's going to build a capacity over the long term for sustainable management through Tanimeva and groups in the local communities. So, it could be a win-win, right? Now, this is all theoretical, right? At least at some level. We have a lot of the structure in place. The government's bought into it. They are happy to give half the money to a private, local NGO, national NGO, to manage. The financial management is now being discussed in terms of where this is invested, how the returns are managed, and so on. But it's going to be important. And, I'm just going to end with this sort of silly but very important observation that, in Africa, you gave a figure. What proportion of people live on the land still? 65? Yeah. 65. And as a general principle, those are the poorest people. And as a general principle, those are the people most dependent on natural resources. And while I think when we get these projects going, what happens in the first instance is we all benefit. In the second instance, once we've benefited, it may be we diverge in our goals and objectives. Certainly we've seen this in indigenous reserve management in Latin America, where the first challenge is tenure. Get people the rights to their lands. I am proud to say, the thing I'm proudest about for WCS's work in Latin America is we are the organization that has helped title more land in Bolivia than any other organization, conservation, governmental, development, or governmental. And getting tenure is critical. And local communities, indigenous communities, people living on the land need that tenure because that gives them the right to start managing it. That keeps the conversation with conservation going, right? Because once it goes into commercial agriculture or natural, mineral extraction, right, we're done. Right? We are now doing a rearguard battle to try and save pieces, get set-asides, and sort of do offsets, but not really manage large-scale landscapes. Once you do that, the hope is people start improving their lot. And you don't want them to continue just to say, okay, we're not going to hunt, we're going to have better agriculture, and we're going to be living at the same miserable level that we're living at now, right? They would like to live at a better level, which may mean that it's not purely substitutional. There may be some additionality in some of the, from a biodiversity perspective, destructive practices will continue. But unless we start that first step of tenure and rights and income down to the ground and figure out how to manage that, conservation's finished. Because as I pointed out, almost all the investment and almost all the interest is in sectors outside of what I'm interested in primarily for my professional life. So I'm going to just end by pointing out, without the forest, there is no water. Without the water, there is no rice. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joshua. I think we have time for some questions from the audience. Sure, yes. We have a microphone, maybe. Thanks. It's just right in the center. Here it comes.
For the sake of discussion, I feel obliged to raise the controversial name of Paul Thoreau. Paul was a writer who, in the 1960s, was a Peace Corps volunteer in Malawi, and he went back for an extended trip through Africa, wrote a book called Black Star Safari. And in it, he commented on deforestation and many of the problems that you talk about, but he also spoke very critically about what he felt was the dependency trap between the inhabitants of Africa and the NGOs and the aid agencies, many of them living in green zones apart, in which there was a lack of initiative was the result on the part of the people. They deferred too much to the agencies and the NGOs. So here, having two representatives, I'd like to hear what they have to say in reply.
Go ahead.
I think that's a very good point, and I think that a lot of NGOs working in Africa are under attack these days by governments who say that they are unguided missiles doing things on their own and not following government policies or programs. I like to look at it a little bit differently in the sense that very often in Africa, governments don't have capacity to reach out to rural communities, isolated communities, underserved communities. So NGOs play a very fundamental role that's very important to reach out where government is not able to reach out and to provide benefits and services to people. Often in my own organization, we say our work begins where the tarmac ends, i.e. we're often 600 to 1,000 miles from the capital.
And I've just come back from taking a group of donors to look at our work, and they were struck by how poor and isolated the areas that we were working in, and that how much it took to get out to service these areas that had no government services being provided. So while people can be critical of civil society and non-governmental organizations, they do have a role, and a very important role, of really reaching the poorest of the poor in many cases, where without them there would be nothing.
I'll go into two other pieces of this. I think the first one is, not only are we in remote areas, but I'm sure Julius does the same thing we do. If you work for a corporation, private corporation, or even the State Department, and you go to some of these areas, you get extra pay because they're hardship posts. Our staff, of course, get paid to go there, and they probably on a local level get paid phenomenally well. But they actually are dying to go there. This is their mission. This is their life. And the level of commitment of the people who go there is quite phenomenal. I think the change that I've seen in the last 20 years that I've been professionally involved, and you've been involved a lot longer, is that in the old days, it was people like me, nice Jewish boys from New York, who went out to the field and did these things. And increasingly, our staff are Africans in Africa, they're Asians in Asia, and they're Latin Americans in Latin America. They're not entirely always from the countries in which they are born. There's some movement, but there's a larger professional class of people from Africa working in these organizations, leading these organizations, and particularly people from local communities being more engaged with them. So what is seen as a monolithic, they call us bingos, big international organizations, actually is an amalgam of local talent and global ability to marshal resources. So, are we, undermining the government when it is to the government's benefit to blame NGOs for things that they can't do? Yes. Are we supporting them? Sure. I mean, there are lots of times when governments actually come to NGOs for assistance because of the networks, our communication networks, our local community connections, to try and help them negotiate new and different development programs in the areas in which they do have responsibility. So it's not just that they can't get there. When they get there, they often rely on the good relationships that years and years of being in a place allow you to develop.
And I would just add to that most NGOs work at the grassroots level, and most of them work with a sense of identification with people at the community level. We're working to help people to improve their quality of life. And what we're going in is not telling them what to do or how to do it. It's asking them what they want to have done and how we can help them to accomplish their objectives. And we let them decide what they want to do because they're in the driver's seats of development. And so we're helping to facilitate the improvement of their quality of life by helping them to achieve their own goals rather than goals established by foreigners. Our people are paid well, but they're not paid very well. Civil society organizations, I think, earn probably a third of what people in the private sector earn. And I agree with Josh that these are very dedicated people. Most of our employees are former Peace Corps volunteers, and they have a passion for what they do and how they go about it. You can't find that in our society in general. The people is highly motivated to get out there and work under very hardship conditions. It's not always easy. People can criticize NGOs, living high off the hog and all those kinds of comments. If I took every dollar that's supplied in my own organization, 91 cents of that dollar goes to the projects and the people of Africa, and only 9 cents out of a dollar goes for administration and fundraising. And those are pretty good odds. If it goes out there in the private sector can beat those odds, let me know, okay?
Any other questions, comments in the back there?
Yes. Do I need a microphone?
I think so, yeah. I think so.
Okay, well, thank you both for, or all three of you rather, for your presentations. And I heard a lot of good comments about water scarcity. And I wanted to add that I think that water quality is an equally large challenge in developing countries. And that in particular, I wanted to raise two examples, one of which is open mines, because in Africa, resource extraction is, as you say, very prevalent. and these mines are not managed very well, so they can often leach contaminants into the groundwater and surface water. And I wanted to also point out that in urban areas, waterborne pathogens are a huge development issue because they affect life. The disability-adjusted life years are pretty large in Africa due to waterborne pathogens. So these water quality issues, I think, should be on equal footing with the water scarcity.
Yes, I completely agree, and actually thank you, Luke, because that's a great plug for tomorrow morning's session on health in the environment, so at 10 o'clock. But we need to wrap it up now. I'm getting the hook sign. So thanks you again for this panel. Wonderful discussion, and